So this is part 5 of my reading and commentary on the Platonic dialogue, the Sophist. It would be a bit of a chore to recap where we have been since we are this far into our series. And there has been a lot of different tributaries that we've taken. But generally speaking, we're talking about the concept of something and the concept of nothing. Now, sorry, I have to pause here for a moment because a thought came to mind about an experience that I had not too long ago. It happens to be a Sunday, and a Sunday evening on the eve of a new work week. Usually every Sunday I go and visit a friend's place. I have a cookout or whatever, and the kids from different families will come and get together and play. It's a nice experience. And usually I'm involved in cooking in some capacity. But I had a conversation with a friend of mine about the concept of atheism versus believing. And it brought to mind the concepts that are being discussed here in this dialogue. There are many things, in fact, that at this level, talking about being and non-being, about oneness and multiplicity, all of these things have philosophical implications for most of our behaviors. Everything that we do is steeped in that type of language that would, whether or not it's explicit or implicit, most of the time it's implicit. These things are, again, involved in some of the most fundamental processes of mind and of who we are. It is at the software level, how we conceptualize the interrelatedness among these various principles. And the reason that I brought my friend up is perhaps it's a long-standing conversation or intrigue of mine. He is on the atheistic side of things. I'm more on the believing side of things. And it's not that there is an antagonism because of these two separate beliefs, but I'm always interested to understand what he believes about things, given the belief in the absence of the theological side of things. Because of course belief is something that exists independent of a belief in a transcendent being. Now we will eventually, in some way, I think, work our way back to this type of arena, this type of conversation. But I want to put a pause on that thought for now and mention that this episode is going to follow a particular structure. In fact, all of my readings and commentaries on the dialogues are probably going to be following this format. And the format has been that I've been reading 2 pages and then going back and reflecting on the information on each page. There has been 1 or 2 times where I've not done that and just sort of gone line by line as we encounter it. But I rather prefer to have some material under our belts and then go back into it and think about things, chew on it for a little bit, because oftentimes that is what is required of us. So I want to back up a little bit and read from a few lines above the page that we're about to get into to give it some more context. And also I'll say that this dialogue is between 2 people, between Theaetetus, who's an Athenian youth, and the visitor, I believe is from Elea, a Greek colony in Italy. So, the visitor says, it seems that there's something like a battle of gods and giants among them, because of their dispute with each other over being. Theaetetus says, how? One group drags everything down to earth, from the heavenly region of the invisible, actually clutching rocks and trees with their hands. When they take hold of all these things, they insist that only what offers tangible contact is, since they define being as the same as body. And if any of the others say that something without body a body is, they absolutely despise him and won't listen to him anymore. Theaetetus responds, these are frightening men you're talking about. I've met quite a lot of them already. The visitor, therefore the people on the other side of the debate defend their position very cautiously. From somewhere up out of sight, they insist violently that true being is certain non-bodily forms that can be thought about. They take the bodies of the other group, and also what they call the truth, and they break them up verbally into little bits and call them a process of coming to be instead of being. There is a never-ending battle going on constantly between them about this issue. Theaetetus says that's true. The visitor, let's talk with each of these groups about the being that they posit. How shall we do it? It's easier to talk with the ones who put being in the forms. They're a gentler people. It's harder, and perhaps just about impossible, with the ones who drag everything down to the body by force. It seems to me that we have to deal with them this way. Namely, mainly by making them actually better than they are, if we somehow could. But if we can't do that, in fact, then let's do it in words, by supposing that they are willing to answer less wildly than they actually do. Something that better people agree to is worth more than what is worse one agrees to. Anyway, we're not concerned with the people. We're looking for what's true. That's absolutely right, says Theaetetus. Then tell the better people to answer you and interpret what they say. All right? Then let them tell us this. Do they say that anything is a mortal animal? Of course they do. And they agree that a mortal animal is an ensouled body? Of course. And so they're placing the soul among the beings? Yes. What then? Do they say that this soul is just, and that soul is unjust? And that this one's intelligent, and that one isn't? Of course, says Theaetetus. But isn't a soul just by the possession and presence of justice, and isn't another soul contrary to it by the possession and presence of the contrary? Yes, they agree with that. But they'll say further that at any rate, what can be present to a thing or absent from it is something. Yes. So since there is justice and intelligence and the rest of virtue, and also their contraries, and moreover since there is a soul in which those things come to be present, do they say that any of these are visible or touchable, or that they are all invisible? Theaetetus says, they can hardly say any of them is visible. The visitor, and what about these invisible things? Do they say that they have bodies? Theaetetus says, they don't give one single answer to that question. They do say that the soul seems to them to have a kind of body. But as far as intelligence, and other things you've asked about are concerned, they are ashamed and don't dare either to agree that they are not beings, or to insist that they are all bodies. Obviously, this breed of men has improved, Theaetetus. The native earthborn giants would never have been ashamed to hold the line for their position. That anything they can't squeeze in their hands is also absolutely nothing. Theaetetus says, that pretty much describes their thinking. Then let's go back to questioning them. It's enough if they admit that even a small part of that which is doesn't have body. They need to say something about what's common to both it and the things that do have a body, which they focus on when they say that they both are. Maybe that will raise some confusion for them. If it does, then think about whether they'd be willing to accept our suggestion that that which is something like the following. Like what? Tell me and maybe we'll know. I'm saying that a thing really is if it has any capacity at all, either by nature to do something or something else, or to have even the smallest thing done to it, even by the most trivial thing, even if it only happens once. I'll take it as a definition. Those which are amount to nothing other than capacity. They accept that, since they don't have anything better to say right now. The visitor says fine. Maybe something else will occur with them later. And to us, too. For now, let's agree with them on this much. All right, says Theaetetus. Let's turn to the other people, the friends of the forms. You serve as their interpreter for us. All right. You people distinguish coming to be and being, and say that they are separate. Is that right? Yes, says Theaetetus. And you say that by our bodies and through perception we have dealings with coming to be, but we deal with real being by our souls and through reasoning. You say that being always stays the same and in the same state, but coming to be varies from one time to another. Theaetetus says we do say that. So at this point that concludes our 2 pages worth of reading. So now I'd like to explore a little bit and see what we can come up with conceptually. Try to have a bigger understanding of where we are and what is being said here. So I want to briefly read again what the visitor describes as the 2 groups that we're talking about here. One group drags everything down to earth from the heavenly region of the invisible, actually clutching rocks and trees with their hands. When they take hold of all of these things, they insist that only what offers tangible contact is, since they define being as the same as body. And if any of the others say that something without a body is, they absolutely despise him and won't listen to him anymore. The other side of the debate defend their position very cautiously, from somewhere up out of sight. They insist violently that true being is certain non-bodily forms that can be thought about. They take the bodies of the one group and also what they call the truth, and they break them up verbally into little bits and call them a process of coming to be instead of being. There's a never-ending battle going on constantly between them about this issue. So in the last episode, I went into some detail talking about the first group. I'll spend some time thinking about it again because I think it's worthwhile. But all the same, I also want to mention, at least to bring into mind, as I mentioned at the outset of this episode, how principles, foundational thoughts or ideas or ways of seeing, ways of perceiving, are often quite deeply ingrained in our conscious software. And I think that this conscious software can be modified. Today I heard the expression that people never change. And on one hand, perhaps there is some truth to it, but like with many things, absolute statements are difficult to hold up to quite serious scrutiny. And while I'm not a relativist in the absolute sense, I am somebody that understands that context matters. And so we have to keep this in mind when we are speaking about these issues. Because at a certain point, it's going to be impossible to understand where we are without giving something context, without giving something we can call body or grounding. Now, where I find myself in terms of belief in between these two groups, I have yet to know and to come to understand. But starting with this first group, I want to speak about this again. This is the group that drags everything down to earth from the heavenly region of the invisible. They're actually clutching rocks and trees with their hands. But the first statement, it seems like there's almost a contradiction there, because there is this belief that there is this realm of the invisible, that they are taking thoughts and ideas and giving them body in the earthly world. So it would be rather strange for them to insist that only what offers tangible contact is, since they are the ones that drug everything down from the heavenly region of the invisible. They define being as the same as body. So we can say, maybe in a more sophisticated sense, that these people, although they recognize the importance of the invisible realm, they believe for something to be, it must be given a body, even if it comes from maybe a different realm. It's hard to say exactly, given one paragraph, but if I had to expand this out a little bit farther, to speak about it in a way that my mind can grasp and to conceptualize, when I think about this arena of the invisible, there are plenty of artistic and interesting areas that the mind can fantasize about and to bring about. There's a world that we can construct about possibilities of existing things. And I don't want to get too far afield in something that would cause us to be incorrect about our thinking. Now, I did mention also at the outset that I am a believer, but belief, in my opinion, is something that is hard-won. It is not something, although it may require us to submit to things that we are uncertain about in the moment to preserve what we may feel that we are certain about on top of the whole. I do not necessarily wish to bring us too far out into that imaginative, potentially false domain. So what do I mean by that? Why do I even bring that up? Because when I think about the heavenly and then the region of the invisible, I think in part of a plane of existence. I wouldn't necessarily call it a dimension, although it would seem likely that if this plane existed, that in order for us to see it or to occupy it, there would be other devices by which we would measure its existence, and by that definition, then it would be a dimension. But I don't necessarily wish to speak about it in those terms for now, because it's really not all that meaningful. So there is this potential for the plane of existence. In the mind, I think it's easy to get lost, to get caught up in the potential for thought to be some internal structure, something that is, here I have to be careful, something that is let's say, but only in a selfish sense, that it is for us. Now, I still struggle a little bit when I think about bringing thoughts into the physical world, because the physical world is modified by thoughts. I could just look out my window right now and I could see cars that are going down the street, and I could see street lights that are on. I can see organized, arranged lawns and landscapes. All of this is not some natural course of action. Now, this natural course of action, I think, is an interesting thing to think about in and of itself. Again, since I am a believer, there is a certain belief that underpins that, but all the same, if we are thinking about the individual in this sense, before we even move back to nature's coming to be, this experience of thought that comes to be into the physical world through mind, through another physical substrate, no less, physical substrate that affords the conscious mind, it would seem that the process is not something that is entirely separate. The process of thought, that is not entirely separate to that physical thing that may manifest at the down the stream. They are still components of the physical world. They are processes of that physical dimension. Moreover, maybe I should say that the physical underpinning of the process affords what we would call the heavenly. Now, heavenly in this sense, I have to think about agency, I have to think about the minded domain here, what is purposeful, what is meaningful, goal-directed behavior, perhaps even direction in and of itself. Purposeful direction, maybe I should just keep it at that. So here we have these people that are actually clutching rocks and trees with their hands. They have established tangible contact. They define being as the same as body. Now I wish, and I think we will, but I wish we had a little bit more about the definition of body in this case. For if we are to define body in the most immediate sense, what body is to me is this sort of meat suit that I wear. It is the physical container that my soul is resting in. It is the hardware that affords the expression of the soul. Now, if the body was all that there is, it probably wouldn't be manifest in this way. It wouldn't really make sense to say that who I am, the spiritual side of me, the I-ness, the purposefulness, is only expressed because of randomness, because of nothing, essentially. It would seem, at least, it is the something from nothing type of argument. And if any of the others say that something without a body is, they absolutely despise him and won't listen to him anymore. Okay, so we have this idea of this group of people. Now, what I haven't gotten into is this second group of people. The other people insist violently that true being is certain non-bodily forms that can be thought about. So let's think about this for a moment. True being. They're not saying being in and of itself, perhaps. But maybe they are. But true being seems to be a bit of a qualifier. That there can be this sort of semi-being which is likely compatible with this thought process of coming to be. So this true being, where does it exist? But we know that it is certain, at least from the argument, in non-bodily forms that can be thought. Now here I have to ask myself the question, well, what is mind and what is thought? From my standpoint, it seems that what I am is a centralized agent. But it doesn't mean that just because the I-ness of me is directing, for the most part, what the body does and where it wishes to go in life. I exist as an entity of many different parts, many different aspects of being, for I can say that there are many cells within my body that are goal-directed that I have no control over. I just expect that they are going to do as they do to continue my body's survival, and it supports this thing of mind that I value so highly because it is myself. I ought to value it at least to a certain degree, no matter how selfless I may try and transform myself. The self is an important thing to being and to existence. And I should say further that the reason that I say this is, if there was somehow a state of mind for which I can occupy the state of a cell, for example, I would be moving, controlled, possessed by what? It's hard to say. I'm not sure I can answer the question. But without the I that directs, without the I that needs, without the I that perhaps is satisfied. Now there's issues that I have with too much I-ness. But without it, it would seem that any sort of coherent action in the world would not be possible. And that although there are downsides to I-ness, it is not for us to abandon I-ness, because it is the state of being that we are provided. Much like the case of body. If we didn't have body, we would not exist in the way that we do. Now, all of this talk about the previous situation, about all that there is body, and again the seeming contradiction of bringing things down from the heavenly, invisible sphere. It's a bizarre set of circumstances that we find ourselves in, regardless of where we go in mind. True being is certain non-bodily forms that can be thought about. So a non-bodily form. So here is where our primary dispute rests. Can there be, in the idea of the form, what can we say of it? We can say that there is a non-bodily form and there is a bodily form. Of the bodily form, we know many. This is something innate to our experience. Do we know non-bodily forms? And I would say that we do. But before I get into that and describe exactly what I think that is, I think it's important to recognize among all of the forms that are, there's only a select number that we would attribute to conscious experience and agentic like we are. But all the same, if we were to say, or if we were to speak of non-bodily forms in the way that we might speak of a physical object, for example, there are plenty of physical objects in front of me, but if I just look out my window again and find a natural bit of land, I pick up a rock or a branch. Could we say that these things, in their purest forms, their true being is in mind and non-bodily? I suppose we could. We would run into the dilemma of speaking about us as persons observing these things. It becomes a dilemma because at this level, at the level of experience that we inhabit, what seems to be most natural and real is what is in front of us. That is what we can grab onto. We can dependably manipulate it. But outside of those things for which man subjectively participates, man also finds himself a participant in a level of reality that is cohabiting with other things that are. And there's a certain headspace that I think one must get into if we are to imagine things that are to be, and as they move into being, as a place outside of just that subjective experience, maybe not outside of, but larger than the subjective, than the agentic, immediate experience. And we imagine the broader scale of it all. Of course, for an observer to be there and to see it all, there must be an agent. The seeing, I think, implies agency. But we attribute this agent to the broader whole. Now, I suppose it's not necessary to attribute an agent to it at all, so let's wind the clock back for a moment and think about this in detail. They insist violently that true being is certain non-bodily forms that can be thought about. They take the bodies of the other group and also what they call the truth, and they break them up verbally into little bits and call them a process of coming to be instead of being. So one way to get there is the identification that within the human mind there are thoughts, that there are ideas, possibilities that can be. Many of them don't come into any sort of physical manifestation, but some of them do. There are plenty of things in front of me that have done so. There's something that I hold in my hand, the pen. At one time it was visualized in mind. It did not exist in a state of nature. The state of nature being a productive agent in and of itself, I suppose. If we attribute that agency on a broad scale, involving many different systems, of the systems themselves, I think we can speak some detail about, and of their purposeful direction. Life affords us quite fascinating groups and categories for which we can identify patterns and movement. So if we start there in mind of the idea of coming to be, do we say that it is only a thing when it comes to be physically, or that it is a being in the mind. I think at the very least we can say that there is a difference between a thought and something that is physically manifest. But I think it would be incorrect to say that the thought is not real because it is something that cannot be grasped, nor is it something that is tangible. Now, I don't necessarily mean to attribute to the former group this assertion, but if everything is bodily, then it would be difficult for them to maintain that this is true being. In the argument that we are having now, it would seem that true being is within this domain of the thoughtful landscape. They take the bodies of the other group, which are physical manifestations. I'll go back a page here. They are the ones that clutch the rocks and the trees with their hands. They insist that only what offers tangible contact is, since they define being as the same as body. So they are taking this body, they take being, and interestingly also what is called truth. This concept is difficult. We may be getting too far ahead of ourselves. I wonder if we should spend a little bit more time on this body and non-body problem. If we skip truth for a moment and move on to the sentence, they break them up verbally into little bits and call them a process of coming to be. So by them, that references to the bodies and truth. And so there must be now something within this breaking up into bits that is significant. For it would seem in the case of the thought that comes to be some physical manifestation, if a person has an idea of a piece of clothing that they would like to design that doesn't exist otherwise, we separate these two circumstances. We may break up the material into different components that would allow the thought to enter into the physical world, into the physical space. Likewise, we may break up the thoughts into little pieces. But at the ends of these two things, at the center place of the thought, there is the identity of the thing that is to be. At the other end, there is the focal point of the thing which has come to be, the shirt with the imagery that was in mind. And so in a way, there is this process of coming to be. And that being here is a bit difficult to say, because what is it? It could be the entire process. Being is both the shirt that is complete, but also the thought that is complete. And what is in between is a series of stages of being, of breaking things down to the principle and thought, principle and material, such that the two can merge and have that creative information flow from one to the other. Now, truth I find to be a difficult piece to this puzzle, because if we take this bodily expression, or maybe the overarching structure of having a thought that comes into some physical manifestation, we can ask the question, is that true? And it wouldn't really make any sense. It would make sense in the sense that we can ask ourselves, is the shirt true, in the way of asking, does it exist? And we can say yes, because of its tangible qualities. We can say, is the shirt true in mind? And we can say yes. There are things that we can point to that lead to its manifestation in mind. But we wouldn't say that it is true in the physical manifestation. And in the case of the physical manifestation, we may not necessarily say it's true in mind, depending on the circumstance. But as a matter of the process of coming to truth, I think we can understand that this is an important procedural element of understanding. And I think that there is a bit of this truth-seeking expression wound up within this very dialogue, that things are being broken down into little bits. And there is this process of coming to understand, of coming to be. Now, just as a reminder, the visitor wishes to speak with the group that we have just spent some time speaking of. The ones who put being in the forms, they're gentler people. He says it's harder with the ones who drag everything down to body by force. He goes on to say that dealing with the contrary type is going to be possible if we make them better, so that they are not as reactionary, perhaps. It seems that it's a dialogical tool to make sense of and to inhabit the opinions of others without also inhabiting those qualities that would move us farther than the truth, from the truth. So he starts this new, the visitor that is, starts this new path of reasoning, by which he says, do they say that anything is a mortal animal? Theaetetus says yes. And they agree that a mortal animal is an ensouled body. And so they're placing soul among the beings. So this is an important, although it's relatively, it seems like it's a relatively small amount of information that we are exposed to, I think that this is an important axial point to spend some time with. Now, within the definition of mortal, I find something fascinating. It's an idea that which is the organism, let's say the human being, could be any sort of animal, is subject to death. Now, what is death? It is the process, or we can say it is the state of being. We can say dying is the process, but death is the state of being nothing, or reduced to one's former state. In death, my body will wither away. The experience that is, as it is occupied now in this body, will finish. It will come to an end. And so, since we've been talking about this grand battle between thingness and no-thingness, in the broader context of trying to identify the Sophist and what he does, to have life itself be subject to eventually to nothing is a tall order. Of course, the snapshot of death itself would be quite depressing if it was not followed up by a rejuvenation, a moving farther into life, as the human species, for example, continues one child after the next. Now, remembering that we are speaking about the more difficult sort that brings everything down into the bodily form, the visitor follows this up by saying, they agree that a mortal animal is an ensouled body. He's asking it as a question. An ensouled body. So there is a contextual difference between the soul and the body. There's also, by way of thinking, an assumption that it is possible for a body to not be ensouled. But of course there are many sorts of bodies. There are many things that are. Just like this pen is something that is. Would we say that it is an ensouled body? I don't think so. But again, at the very least, we can say that of the ensouled body that the human being possesses, it is of a different sort than if we can say any such thing about the ensouled body of the pen. And it is by this difference, I think, that we are speaking about here. The soul is something that I think is always difficult to define. I have my ideas about it. If I had to describe it or enter into some definition of it, I would say that the soul, as I experience it, is a sense of agency. But it's an agency that is dependent upon certain factors: self-awareness, consciousness. We could say a connection to God, or a connection to the source of soul, the source of spirit, from an idea that what has been given to me, or what I possess, is not for me to say that I am the creator of it, but rather the inhabitor of it. That my soul is connected to something more than just myself. And if we don't wish to use the word God, then we can say of the multitude of processes that occur in the natural world, we are certainly a part of it. We are also quite intimately a part, although perhaps a small piece, in the broader machine that is our civilization. And we occupy, each of us, our various corners of that society. We contribute to it, whether we believe we do or not. And by this connectedness, again, I speak of this because I'm trying to cover all bases. So even at these levels, we can see the connectedness that a soul, or the extension of us, to something that is greater, to something that is not just the individual, to something that doesn't reduce us to pride or conceit. the ensouled body. And so they are placing soul among beings. So why is this important? Well, the soul is not something that exists externally as a physical object. It's not as though when a human being is born, we go to the container of souls, and then we feed the child the soul so that they can somehow inhabit this experience and be aware of themselves and be able to love and all of this sort of thing. The soul is a process that emerges through the software that is innate in us. And I suppose that there's a bit of prideful expression in what I say here about what we are, but what we are relative to other mortal beings on this planet does seem unique. But perhaps that's a mistake, I don't know. And so they're placing soul among the beings. Now, I will say that, just to remove myself a little bit from this, the prideful trap, the conceited trap, I think that there is soul within various animals. Of all of them, I don't know. And just like I mentioned with the pen, it is difficult to say exactly how deep this type of belief might actually go. For what would the soul of the pen be? Certainly it is an identity, it is something that is, and it is connected to something that has come to be. And by the second group, we can say that it has gone through the process of coming to be. Surely at some level there is this, not necessarily self-awareness, but a connectedness to other things that gives it a sense of soul that may be amplified in man's experience. So we've gone into a new direction when the visitor says, do they say that this soul is just and that soul is unjust, and that this one's intelligent and that one isn't? Theaetetus says, of course. But isn't a soul just by the possession and presence of justice? So what does that mean? Now, just being that condition of being right or wrong. Now, in the presence of justice, there is possibility, surely. An agent has the ability to choose between that which is right and that which is wrong. But surely, if a soul possesses and understands that which is just, then they are that thing. And he says, by the opposite, it is also true in that way. But here I have to wonder about the first group or first contention. That what we see is a group that believes so mightily in the role of the body and of tangible things, of physical things, earthly things we might call it. And of these earthly things, it seems rather strange to me, although at the outset I had recognized the first expression, that the group also believes that they brought down from the heavenly that which is to be the tangible, the earthly. One group drags everything down to earth from the heavenly region of the invisible. So in this way we can see that the soul is a part of that experience, but all the same, this antagonism between the two groups becomes a little bit more confused, because why would it be the case that if there's a group that believes in the intangible, that is being brought down to being into the bodily form, and the other believes in true being is certain non-bodily forms that can be thought about, is there much of a difference here? Now, if one group believes so heavily in the value and the virtue of the body, whereas the other thinks that only true being is in non-bodily forms, then of course we can see how there's a friction there. But as a matter of belief, it's not really far off, not far different. But all the same, when we think about the first group, who is so heavily invested in the bodily and the physical domain, when we bring the soul into it, it seems to throw a wrench into that equation. The visitor says, but they'll say farther that at any rate, what can be present to a thing or absent from it is something. So there's a couple things here. The first that comes to mind is we have to, I think a little bit more about what is being said in the previous line. But isn't a soul just by the possession and presence of justice? And isn't another soul contrary to it by the possession and presence of the contrary? So there's this case that is being made that the presence of the contrary of something is something, because the soul will be what is contrary to the thing that has been identified, in that case, the just soul. So there can be an injustice just as much as there can be a justice. It is that inversion. And so we extend that out to say that what can be present to a thing or absent from it is something. And this has, I think, quite large implications. So since there is justice and intelligence and the rest of virtue, there's this concreteness about the ideas, the justice, the intelligence, virtue, and also their contraries. And moreover, since there is a soul in which those things come to be present, let's pause there for a moment. There is this bin, this possibility of the agent that inhabits that which is not. Justice as this thing that is filled with ideas about that which is right and wrong, intelligence about identifying patterns in the environment, linking different nodes and various networks together to make sense of patterns, and a virtue, those expressions of being that allow us to understand goodness and bring stability and peace of mind to the structure of our societies. The conditions are something that I feel evades my mind at times, that I'm such an aloof participant in life that sometimes the structure or beautiful things pass me by. What do I mean? When I was thinking about the soul just now, I thought about the idea of innate virtue, of innate intelligence, of which surely that hardwired matter predisposes us to. But just as much as our natural inclinations, we have that that reciprocal, the basin, the bowl, again, through which, or in which, these forms that we identify as justice, intelligence, and virtue, that they rest in. There are thoughts of these separate entities apart from man. What would they be in absence of man, without any conscious agent to live them through? Would they still be? They're contraries, surely, but there would necessarily need to be an agent to be able to think about them for them to be. If there was no agent for them to be, we would still call them something, but it would just be absence in that case. If there was something that would be able to identify it, it would be something, because it could be seen, it could be realized, it could be made tangible. As our first group would be so ecstatic to consider. Since there is a soul in which those things come to be present, do they say that any of these are visible or touchable, or that they are all invisible? Theaetetus says, they can hardly say that any of them is visible. And what about these invisible things? Do they say that they have bodies? So excuse me for a moment. Today happens to be a new day, and a new day brings new thoughts. And here I find myself tasked with the responsibility of resuming that previous thought. There was a thought that had occurred to me not long ago about the product of my mind, and how at times I find it so difficult to pay attention to things. In the end, I find it to be a willful thing whether or not I choose to pay attention to something. I know that that which I pay attention to matters, and that orientation affords me with love, or its opposite. And so with the goal of understanding that which is true in mind, I wish to enter back into this experience, to learn and to understand. So Theaetetus responds, they don't give one single answer to that question. They do say that the soul seems to have a kind of body. But as far as intelligence and other things you've asked about are concerned, they are ashamed and don't dare either to agree that they are not beings, or to insist that they are all bodies. So let's pause here for a moment and reflect on things. Apart from the soul being quite a difficult thing to identify, to define, I think it is definable. But outside of that difficulty, we are exposed to, maybe it could be said, something that's not more fundamental as in the sense of more important, but fundamental in the sense of a simpler building block. This visible and invisible. Maybe we can also say that this is a characteristic of this domain that we're talking about, of the soul and of the body. The soul is something that generally conceived is an invisible structure, whereas the body is material. It is quite readily perceivable to man's experience. The soul doesn't seem to necessarily need many material or physical causes to explain it, although we could. But what's within it and its expression is something that is experienced more than it is observed and measured. The body, on the other hand, is full of physical quantities, things that can be measured. Surely it can also be experienced to a degree. The mind and the body are not separate. So focusing on what Theaetetus has said here, they don't give one single answer to the question. Again, the question that is posed by the visitor, and what about these invisible things? Do they say that they have bodies? Of course, it would be difficult to answer. Here I find my inner contrarian wishing to come out in full force. But it is a sticky situation. It's a bit liminal. It is in the in-between that we find ourselves. For what would it mean if these invisible things had a body? We can say of mind, of spirit, of soul, that this is embodied. So it's not far out of our experience to imagine how this might be true. But to separate invisible things and to ask if that invisible thing has a body. Difficult to answer. What does it mean in that context? In the physical world, in the world, the level of reality that we find ourselves in, this physical substrate is necessary to main soul and mind. Perhaps I should be careful about my words, but at least there's some reason to expect that to exist in this form, in this way, in this plane, that embodiment is necessary, fundamental. Now, if we separate this out a little bit and we talk about the soul, we talk about invisible things that have bodies, I don't necessarily think it's productive to go about thinking of invisible things in the way that man's perception is limited, such that there's only so much that he can perceive. And because of this limitation, the invisible things lie still within that plane of experience, but just beyond his perception. In one way, there are plenty of things that occupy this territory, but we quickly fall into that material causal relationship, for which, again, I don't think it's going to serve us much productive territory. Rather, as a placeholder, I wish to think about these things as in a plane, not a dimension, because a dimension implies measurement, but rather a plane, a layer, like a multi-layered cake, for example. How that would manifest physically, I don't know. But I have to keep my mind here as a placeholder until I mature to something that is maybe more reasonable or readily understandable. But going back to this idea, again, about the soul being this invisible thing that has a body. In this case, it would not necessarily mean that the body implies physicality. And so there would be this issue between the class of people that wishes for everything that is to be tangible, that this is somehow maybe reasonable to a degree, but it only gets us so far. It's not completely true, in other words. Because we can say that tangible things are real, surely. But we can also say that things that are not readily perceivable are real, even in the physical, material, causal sense. They don't give one single answer to that question. They do say that the soul seems to have a kind of body. A kind of body. But as far as intelligence and the other things you've asked about are concerned, they're ashamed and don't dare either to agree that they are not beings or to insist that they are all bodies. So let's think about this a little bit more. But as far as intelligence and the other things that you've asked about are concerned, they're ashamed. And why would they be ashamed? They don't dare either to agree that they are not beings or to insist that they are all bodies. They are ashamed because where they found themselves to believe now is faced with a difficult proposition, something that is contrary, and reasonably so, something that they must wrestle with if they are going to maintain their beliefs. The visitor says, "Obviously this breed of men has improved, Theaetetus. The native earth-born giants would never have been ashamed to hold the line for their position. That anything they can't squeeze in their hands is absolutely nothing." Now I find this to be a fascinating statement for its implications. So I would read through it again. He mentions the breed of men being improved from some prior state of man, some prior state of being. The native earthborn giants. This is a category that is not well defined in our mythological landscape here. So, this is from ChatGPT 4.0. What I'm after here is understanding the giant and the place in Greek society. So the giant isn't necessarily a literal being, but it is, or a physical being, let's say. It can be a physical being, but it's more of a large symbolic structure to define a particular type of philosopher or thinker. So specifically they represent the materialists or empiricists. These are those who assert that only what is physical, touchable, and extended in space is real. Of course, we know we are talking about this. These are of the tangible sorts. If something can't be grasped or measured, it is treated as non-existent. So this includes early natural philosophers like the atomists, like Democritus, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and others who explain the cosmos strictly in terms of bodies, elements, and physical forces. And this is reminiscent of our own culture. Many people believe this way today. So, describing this earth-born metaphor, it refers to giants in Greek mythology, offspring of the earth, or Gaia, like those who fought the Olympian gods. They are brutish, strong, and grounded, literally of the earth, meaning they are all strength, no mind, anti-divine, anti-intellectual in the mythic framework. So the metaphor is meant to satirize the materialist philosophers as intellectually earthbound, unable or unwilling to recognize invisible, intelligible realities. So there's a double meaning. The giants from myth being huge, brutish, rebellious figures who oppose the gods. The philosophical giants, the materialists who oppose metaphysical or idealist views. When it says anything they can't squeeze in their hand is nothing, a cosmic exaggeration of the empirical mindset, which accepts only what is visible, tangible, and measurable. So when the visitor says that this breed of person has improved, it's ironic. The materialists have grown more sophisticated in how they defend their views. They no longer make their assertions so crudely. They may now use arguments, terminology, or theoretical language, but the core belief is the same. Only the physical is real. So to list out the philosophical structure. So this is one half of the duality that we are about to experience in this dialogue, or that we have been experiencing, let's say. We have the giants, or the materialists. They believe only in bodies, touch, extension, use of sensation as criterion, deny being to anything incorporeal, represent Heracliteans, atomists, empiricists. And then we have the gods, the idealists. Believe in forms, souls, invisible reality, use of reason as criterion, deny being to matter without form, represent Platonists, Pythagoreans, Eleatics. The native earth-born giants would never have been ashamed to hold the line for their position, that anything they can't squeeze in their hands is absolutely nothing. An interesting progression of thought. We have a bit of an exposure to a cultural line of thinking. Something quite useful, I feel, to be taken with us in our daily lives. The symbol of this giant. But perhaps more importantly, the more sophisticated and developed argument that has progressed past the giant, that occupies this materialist view, perhaps not as headstrong or as body strong as the giants, but still nonetheless seen through that lens of empirical understanding, through observation and measurement. Theaetetus responds that pretty much describes their thinking. And the visitor says, let's go back to question them. It's enough if they admit that even a small part of that which is doesn't have a body. I'd have to imagine, if I was the sort that believed that everything that was, everything that is material, is measurable by our device, that it would be quite difficult to admit that there can be something that is without having a body. But here we find ourselves, that group seemingly, what it seems like, progressing in understanding. I don't really like the word, but have moved in understanding. They are matured, as the visitor alludes to. This breed of men has improved. So there's something so fundamental about the invisible, the non-tangible, those aspects of things that are without a body, that cannot be dispensed with, even in the strictest sense. And what seems to be coming here is a further questioning on that front. They need to say something about what's common to both it and the things that do have body, which they focus on when they say that they both are. Maybe that will raise some confusion for them. If it does, then think about whether they'd be willing to accept our suggestion that that which is something like the following. A thing really is if it has any capacity at all, either by nature to do something to something else, or to have even the smallest thing done to it by even the most trivial thing, even if it only happens once. I'll take it as a definition that those which are amount to nothing other than capacity. So this is quite a significant piece to our dialogue. This is one of the first times, maybe the first time, a significant time, surely, that we have a definition of that which is by the visitor. And so I think it deserves some time to think about the interrelatedness of these words. A thing really is if it has any capacity at all. So, if we go to the etymology of the word capacity, from Middle English we have volume, ability, capability. From the Old French we have ability, size, competence. From Latin we have ability, capability, breadth, fullness. And continuing in Latin, we have capable of holding much, spacious, to take, hold, or seize. So from the Latin, I get these images of the masculine and the feminine, the one that holds, the one that seizes. And there's this idea of volume, again, something that holds, and then ability, something that does, perhaps something that penetrates. And so of capacity, we have these two things that are the receiver and then the actor. Either by nature to do something to something else, or to have even the smallest thing done to it by even the most trivial thing, even if it only happens once. So now thinking about capacity again, real quick. Can it be said of something that is outside of this definition? Is everything that we understand to be capable of something, or maybe has the capacity for something? Now my mind goes immediately to things that are not as heavily produced or influenced by the hand of man. And I wish to go outside, or just to look out my window, so forgive me for a moment as I move my microphone so I can shift my view. So to my surprise, it happens to be raining at the moment. It's in the evening. It is a Tuesday evening. But out my window, I live on the 4th floor of a building, and I see the very tip of a large tree. And across the way, I see another quite large tree that is above the height of a 3-story building. of these things that are, they have I want to say much ability. They are capable entities. They are biological. I can think of the dirt in a similar manner. It's capable of holding. I think about space, the space in between one tree and the other, myself in the first tree, the tree in the second tree. That space is capable of holding much. It's spacious. Part of the thing that I think that we might run into an issue with here is that it is quite broad, and it necessarily has to be if it's to encompass everything that is. But I wonder, in so doing, we haven't really said much at all. So let's sit with this for a little bit longer. The ending of that little paragraph, the visitor says, "I'll take it as a definition that those which are amount to nothing other than capacity." I wonder at the difficulty. I wonder at the struggle. It's a wonder that we wish to find an equivalence at all, because any equivalence that we find, or any way of describing that which is, will necessarily lead us to the same breadth, the same fullness as is the Latin definition or Latin meaning of the precursor to that modern word capacity. We find so much there. And I'm afraid that it really doesn't help us understand what that which is. We've placed another broad word for a quite broad topic. But I raise the question, why would we even be concerned about bringing in another word to describe it? I suppose it gives it some functionality, it gives it some purpose. And to give something purpose, to give it meaning, allows it to be more readily intuited or made intelligible by mind. So as far as conceptual grasping is understood, perhaps there's some utility in it. The sense that we're prompted to consider something that has a innate ability to do something to something else, or to even have the smallest thing done to it by even the most trivial thing. Again, as I was describing earlier, we have this passive and active element. The active reminds me of more of the masculine, penetrating front, and then the passive, feminine, receiving. And I suppose of these two, we have something that is more defined, whereas that which is, we don't even have the conception of this masculine and feminine, or the active and the passive. We just have that which is. And not only do we have these, the active and the passive elements, the something that is doing something to something else, or something that is having something done to it, we have also the trivialness of a particular action, or experience, or phenomena. Now, what is this trivial? It would imply, I suppose there's many ways in which we can characterize it. From the individual perspective, if something is trivial, it doesn't mean much. Perhaps it's something that is commonplace. The effect is small. We could say the same for the material scenario. If a comet slams into a planet void of life, we have the active element, we have the receiving element. In terms of the planet, the passive element or the receiving element, if the comet is large enough, it can cause quite a bit of a change. What is done is quite large. On the other hand, we can have a slight change in the application of force that causes a small stone to roll downhill. There are many different things along that trajectory that have something done to it, but its action is trivial. It doesn't mean much, it doesn't do much, it doesn't displace much material. Now what we find after this bit of dialogue is that we finish talking about the class of people that believe that all that which is that which is tangible. Theaetetus goes on to say that they accept what the visitor had just said since they don't have anything better to say right now. The visitor says fine, maybe something else will occur to them later, and to us too. For now, let's agree with them on this much. Let's turn to the other people, the friends of the forms. You serve as their interpreter for us. So here our reflection essentially ends. There's a couple lines that are still on the second page that we've gone through, but I'm going to read through the next 2 pages and then go back and interpret. Reflect on it. The visitor says, "You people distinguish coming to be and being and say that they are separate. Is that right?" "Yes." "And you say that by our bodies and through perception we have dealings with coming to be, but we deal with real beings by our souls and through reasoning. You say that being always stays the same and in the same state, but coming to be varies from one time to another." "We do say that," says Theaetetus. "And what shall we say this dealing with is that you apply in the 2 cases? Doesn't it mean what we said just now?" "What?" "What happens when 2 things come together, and by some capacity one does something to the other, or has something done to it?" "Or maybe you don't hear their answer clearly, Theaetetus." "But I do, probably because I'm used to them." "Then what account do they give?" "They don't agree with what we just said to the earth people about being." "What's that?" "We took it as a sufficient definition of beings that the capacity be present in a thing to do something or have something done to it, or even by the smallest thing or degree." "Yes." "In reply they say that coming to be has the capacity to do something or have something done to it, but that this capacity doesn't fit with being." "Is there anything to that?" We have to reply that we need them to tell us more clearly whether they agree that the soul knows and also that being is known. Theaetetus says yes, they say. The visitor, "Well then, do you say that knowing and being known are cases of doing, or have something done, or both? Is one of them doing and the other having something done, or is neither a case of either?" Theaetetus says, "Obviously that neither is a case of either, since otherwise they'd be saying something contrary to what they said before." "Oh, I see. You mean that if knowing is doing something, then necessarily what is known has something done to it. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it, which we say wouldn't happen to something that's at rest." "That's correct." "But for heaven's sake, are we going to be convinced that it's true that change, life, soul, and intelligence are not present in that which wholly is, and that it neither lives nor thinks, but stays changeless, solemn, and holy, without any understanding? If we did, sir, we'd be admitting to something frightening. The visitor: But are we going to say that it has understanding but doesn't have life? Of course not, says Theaetetus. But are we saying that it has both those things in it while denying that it has them in a soul? How else would it have them, says Theaetetus? And are we saying that it has intelligence, life, and soul, but that it's at rest and completely changeless, even though it's alive? Theaetetus says, all that seems completely unreasonable. Then both that which changes and also change have to be admitted as being. Of course, says Theaetetus. And so, Theaetetus, it turns out that if no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything. Absolutely not. But furthermore, if we admit that everything is moving and changing, then on that account we take the very same thing away from those which are. Why? Says Theaetetus. Do you think that without rest anything would be the same, in the same state and in the same respects? Not at all. The visitor says, well then, do you see any case in which intelligence is or come to be anywhere without these things? Not in the least, says Theaetetus. And we need to use every argument we can to fight against anyone who does away with knowledge, understanding, and intelligence, but at the same time asserts anything at all about anything. Definitely. The visitor says, the philosopher, the person who values these things the most, absolutely has to refuse to accept the claim that everything is at rest, either from defenders of the one or from friends of the many forms. In addition, he has to refuse to listen to people who make that which is change in every way. He has to be like a child begging for both, and say that which is everything is both unchanging and that which changes. True. Well now, apparently we've done a fine job of making our account pull together that which is, haven't we? Absolutely. But for heaven's sake, Theaetetus, now I think we'll recognize how confused our investigation about it is. Why, though? What do you mean? The visitor says, don't you notice, my young friend, that we are now in extreme ignorance about it, though it appears to us that we are saying something? So that's the end of these 2 pages. And you know, something that occurred to me at the end of those 2 pages, when he says something to the effect of, we've sort of brought ourselves back to this point of not really knowing where we are, sort of being ignorant of everything, in a sense that we're no better off than where we were. Perhaps better off in terms of understanding the Sophist, but all the same, it's funny how the dialogues can play with your mind in this way. That's why I think it's important to go back and reflect, because one ought to develop their own understanding, take away ideas, incorporate them into some broader framework, let's say, but also follow the dialogue and see where they go, see what new things pop up. So with this in mind, we're going to reflect on the content of the 2 pages. I always have difficulty, especially when I'm speaking something that I'm reading, to pay attention to what I'm reading, so this will almost be like I'm going through it anew, again. So in the previous page, we discussed that we're now turning our attention to the friends of the forms. And one more time, I want to go back to our research about the idealists, let's say, as opposed to the materialists that we were speaking of. These people believe in forms, souls, invisible reality. They use reason as a criterion, deny being to matter without form, represent Platonists, Pythagoreans, and Eleatics. So let's get into it. You people distinguish coming to be and being, and say that they are separate. So what are we to say here? So until now, we really haven't discussed coming to be. It's either to be, not to be, that which is not, thingness, nothingness. And so I think this new principle, coming to be, is a good one. Now, put in a poor context, I think it may not necessarily be good, but coming to be is something that I've talked about in my own journey through this dialogue with these interlocutors. So what is to be said about this coming to be? Well, it's a dynamic thing. It's something that is occurring. It is a process. And we talked about before, an image comes to mind of this undulating nature, of things that come into absence or to some end, and then by their ending, the constituent elements, the principles, whatever, they participate in a new process of creation. So we could think about this at any number of levels. We can think about it in terms of the human life. My life will come to an end. Even if I don't have children, the human species will continue. Perhaps we can say that the human species will come to an end at some point. What will continue, hopefully, is something that we have created. Now, I know that there's a lot of anxiety that is built up in that expression, especially now, since we are on this eve of some bizarre intelligence revolution. But let us not get distracted there. I have maintained, and I still maintain, that which is not is beneath or submissive to, subservient to that which is. And that which not is only intelligible because it is surrounded by a framework of that which is. And that the process of coming to be, or the the undoing of something, is the very way in which we can finally understand how nothingness participates in our world without destroying meaning, destroying thingness. And I have a feeling that my opinions on this matter may be altered slightly, or perhaps a lot, as I grow. Because there are things that come to mind now that I struggle with. I won't get into them. They'll come out in time, but at least for now, what seems to make most sense to me is that which is not is only stable in that proper relationship to that which is. And again, that process of coming to be is moving into something from a state of less thingness, let's say. We can ask the question, and this I guess gets to the heart of my anxiety about it, but we can ask the question that which comes to be, where has it come from? Must it also come from being? And I would say that yes, probably it has to. But we also have the concept of nothingness. How can the human being exist if we imagine a state of the universe, let's say for example, materially speaking, under the conditions in which many of the atoms for which his own body is constituted did not even exist. And I think it spurs a reflection on not only the vastness of possibilities through which material, but also forms of that which can be, can result out of something that is quite simple. Newness, new thingness, requires that environment of nothing to move into, to build, to create. We can get lost in likelihoods, but the likelihoods will not serve us any purpose, really. At least in this context. You people distinguish coming to be and being and say that they are separate. So should we say that they are separate? Now, this is my personal opinion. They can be separated in the fact that one is a process and one is a state. But I think it would be difficult to separate them completely. Because on what grounds can you draw a line between the two and say, this coming to be, if it is separated from being, that being will still continue, or that the process of coming to be will still continue? It's like cutting off blood supply to an extremity and expecting it to survive. I think there's a continuity between the two. But nonetheless, of these people, the believers in the forms, we are following the idea, the assertion that they distinguish coming to be and being, and that they are separate. You say that by our bodies and through perception we have dealings with coming to be. So what do we say about this? By our bodies and through perception we have dealings with coming to be. Now, it may be the case that I don't understand what it is being described here as coming to be. But certainly, as I reflect on my experience in life, the first thing that comes to mind, now, my life as it pertains to what is said here, of course, but the first thing that I think about is all of the perceptual cues that I experience throughout the day that I do not focus on, that I just take in and form this implicit map of the environment to participate in, especially when I'm sort of in that flow state. I think we all understand this to a degree. When we are at work, many things are automatic. Even quite complex processes can become routine and automatic. So although this is the first thing that I think about, I wonder, since we are prompted to consider perception, body, we come to be aware of something by this taking in of information. Now, by this experience, we could say, potentially, that what has come to my understanding is that intrinsic map of the environment. And as I say that, I think there might be a little bit more than just the map of the environment that's established. Because we are an interactive participant with the map. We are not just passive observers of the map. We don't just sit there and think about what it feels like for the smallest air molecule to pass by our finger. When we wave it through the air, at what point do we finally begin to feel something that resembles a sensation? This is not our experience. We go through life and we adapt to those changes as we execute various purposes and various tasks. By our bodies and through perception, we have dealings with coming to be. Coming to be. I think I have to understand this coming to be a little bit better. I mentioned that there are plenty of ways in which something can be wound up or wound together into something that is. We can take the constituent elements of a coin, for example. There was quite the process in rendering the metals down to such a purity, and then finally to the shape desired to make a coin, to make a quarter. I would say that this is a process of coming to be, that the identity of something is being specified as something else is being changed or modified. So, if who we are, if what we do, can be examined by these processes of coming to be at various levels. Let's say moving from adolescence to adulthood, or from one job to the next, or from one skill set to the next, or one state of mind to the next. There is this process that occurs. And although we may not necessarily reflect on those individual pieces of information that we take in through the environment, whether it be a touch, a series of touches, a series of conversations, the audible sensory input, whatever it happens to be, all of this information is leading to the process of coming to be something else, some change that is occurring. And although I haven't grasped the entirety of the 2 pages that I've just read and have yet to reflect on, I am aware that change is going to be a big part of what we are going to discuss. But we deal with real being by our souls and through reasoning. Now, the interesting part of this is the distinction, but we deal with real being, as opposed to coming to be through the body. Now, the distinction between the body and the soul is a fascinating one. I raise the question, is it the case that the information that comes in from the body, is it possible that this influences the soul? My inclination is to say yes. The information is not the information contributes to the meaning generator. The meaning generator is something that is afforded by the physical structure of mind, but the physical structure of mind is not the thing that is responsible for the meaning. The meaning is created by it, but it is created by it in an environment that allows for it. Just like we can say that in this reality that we inhabit, constructing a building is possible out of certain materials because of certain laws of nature. Because of these laws, we can manipulate our surrounding environment and build things. And we build things because our buildings reliably participate under that structure of natural laws. So they don't fall over as soon as we build them. The laws don't change. Now forgive me, but today is a new day. And like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I was thinking a little bit about that last bit of recording and where exactly to go from there. Thinking about the last analogy about natural law. There's a part of me that wishes to fall into the categorical. That is, moving towards form and body as separate rather than understanding their connection. And there's a particular point that rests within something that has been mentioned about perception. Not just perception. But let me stay there for a moment. Perception as it relates to the information that we are able to perceive at our level of experience. We all know that there are various forms, types of information that exist in nature that we cannot perceive. In fact, much of what is there to perceive, we do not perceive. Now, because I say that, I don't necessarily mean to imply that there is an entire structure of invisible things that, just like I sit in this chair, there are other beings that sit physically in the same space. I don't mean to say that the hidden is as extensive as this, but I also don't mean to say that it's not either. I just mean to say that there are plenty of things that we are unaware of, given our current level of perception. And I think that, depending on how one may see this, whether it be fortunate or unfortunate, given that we are the only species on this planet that occupies, what would I say? I don't want to say intelligence, of course, because there are plenty of intelligent species on this planet of varying degrees. But our species is surely unique. If there was another species that had quite a different bodily form than ours, that had a similar level of intelligence, that organized themselves similarly or perhaps even more sophisticatedly, it would be quite an interesting relationship and interaction between the beings. But this is not the case. And I raise this because of our singularity in this experience. I think it limits us in terms of our understanding. We are less traveled consciously than we otherwise could be. We experience, as it is said, or we deal with real being by our souls and through reasoning. With real being. And this is, I think, where the debated topic is going to come up. The real being. That there is this separation between, again, the body and the mind, the soul. You say that by our bodies and through perception, we have dealings with coming to be. But we deal with real being by our souls and through reasoning. Now, I mentioned before, the coming to be is this sort of process. But of course, as we approach being, it's not as though we are not being. We are. And so the question is, when we speak of that which is, or that which is, where is it that we speak of it? And I say this in the context of the process of change. Change is continually occurring. But of course, at any particular moment we can identify something, like a snapshot. And there are many layers, many frames through which we can see experience pass us by and information flood our systems. As I sit here now, I had this sense that, of course, time is moving, that things are changing, that the process of coming to be has not stopped. The process of ending has not stopped. And yet I don't necessarily wish to say that this process of coming to be and ceasing to be is all that there is. I think that there are identifiable characteristics. Much like, bringing back the house example, as time goes by, things erode and things decay. Eventually we replace things. It could be wood panels on the siding of a house, it could be flooring, it could be repainting a room or whatever it happens to be. In the body, the cells replace themselves, and yet this thing that I am remains. It persists. There's a consistent identity throughout time. In fact, identity implies sameness. And so, while at various times, frustratingly perhaps, because at one time versus another the speed by which I come to be or come to an end of something may vary, and this may alter my perception of my identity at any given moment, there are consistent qualities, consistent grounded factors about me that remain. And I think psychologically speaking, it would be to my detriment to shake them too radically, too fundamentally, too quickly. For such a change, if I was not ready, could be disastrous. It could also be quite beautiful in the case of surrendering to something that was safe to surrender to, like Christ, for example. So an example of what we are doing now is reasoning. Through various forms, we are coming to understand something that is true. The Platonic version of this is through the dialectic, through opposing ideas. But there are plenty of ways through which we go through this process that we call reasoning. Now I come back again to the soul. The soul being this thing that allows us to experience real being. No matter how many times I go through the exercise and trying to define it, it always seems to amaze me at the concept of the soul. The other interesting part of this is that there is this separation between reasoning and the soul. Seemingly to suggest that that process by which we come to understand is different than the process through which we experience. Experience meaningful things, perhaps. You say that being always stays the same and in the same state, but coming to be varies from one time to another. So just as we've said, there is this seeming separation between the two. But we have to figure out a way to reconcile that which changes constantly and that thing of sameness, the identity. And so I'll take with me that analogy to the house, through which the physical things break down and we have to replace them every once in a while. It's up to us whether or not we wish to replace them in a manner that was similar to the parts that became eroded and degraded, or to change them into something entirely different and risk changing the identity of the house. The visitor says, "And what shall we say this dealing with is that you apply in the two cases? Doesn't it mean what we said just now?" Now, if I haven't said this before, this is exactly where I would like this to go. Not that it matters so much where I wish I would like it to go, but all the same, when he said initially that by our bodies and through perception we have dealings with coming to be, but we deal with real being by our souls, etc., etc., both the dealings with coming to be, the dealings with the real being by our souls through reasoning, in order to understand, I think, both the coming to be and encountering the real through the soul, that would require a little bit more exposition, a little bit more exploration. And so that's sort of why I'm excited to hear where we are going to go with this. The visitor says, "What happens when two things come together, and by some capacity one does something to the other, or has something done to it?" Or maybe you don't hear their answers clearly, Theaetetus. But I do, probably because I'm used to them. So let's think about this capacity argument again. That what it is after is describing that which is. That which is only possible if there is this capacity. It must be able to be acted upon, or it must be able to do the action. And then the visitor here, rather interestingly, probably believes that Theaetetus would not be able to manage the conversation on the part of the ones who support the forms, let's say. And so he guides him along that path. He says, "They don't agree with what we just said to the earth people about being. We took it as a sufficient definition of beings that the capacity be present in a thing to do something or have something done to it, to or even the smallest thing or degree. In reply, they say that coming to be has the capacity to do something or have something done to it, but that this capacity doesn't fit with being." Just as an aside note, I find it kind of funny how we're becoming so familiar with these two groups of people, the philosophical groups, that the visitor is referring to the former group as the earth people. But that aside, I want to read those the latter two pieces of dialogue by the visitor again, just to highlight them. "We took it as a sufficient definition of beings that the capacity be present in a thing to do something or have something done to it, to by even the smallest thing or degree. But the rebuttal, coming to be has the capacity to do something or to have something done to it, but that this capacity doesn't fit with being." Now, why would we go there? That it would seem that being although certainly affected by capacity, because if I am to say that I'm a being, I am either passive or active in my pursuits. There is something that may come to me, or I may put something forth into the world. So what can we speak of this? How can we make sense of it? I think one thing that is important here is to recognize that in the rebuttal, they say that coming to be has the capacity, but not that which is itself. So if we go back and now we think about in the position of the people of the forms, that they maintain that the effects of capacity occur within the coming to be space, how does that change the argument? I'm afraid that we were just exposed to this capacity argument, and now we are being asked to shift it in a different way, so we run the risk of being a little adolescent in our experience of this, but I think taking capacity and then submitting it to that process of coming to be, we necessarily restrict the beingness, or maybe the true being, as the people of the forms describe. But these end states, as I've maintained, I don't think are entirely separate. But with that aside, so we can explore this argument, they seem to believe that there are solid states of being, let's say. The degree to which they're solid, I don't really understand, because I maintain a degree of solidity in my argument of being, or of identity. But because it's so related to that transformational process, the process of coming to be, I suppose I have a little bit of difficulty seeing those foundational studs. But anyway, this capacity of coming to be, or rather, the capacity itself, to have something done to it, or do something to someone. If we remove this from the true identity, from the principle of the thing, if I think about myself and the principled identity, trying my best to identify those things within myself that are constant, subject to change, but constant enough to maintain the silhouette of me, this human being that has had a life, emotions, memories, the soul, and the way that we conceptualize it. Something unique, a unique personality, a unique voice, a particular direction. And to say that this being who I am is disconnected from capacity in some way, now perhaps I see too much into this, but it seems like that would be one logical place to go, that if it is not with that which is at the foundational level, but only in the betweens, then it would seem that I am not this true being or true form. An interesting conception that we'll have to read more into. The visitor says, we have to reply that we need them to tell us more clearly whether they agree that the soul knows, and also that being is known. And the answer to that is yes. So why is this significant? We're bringing in a few different components here. At this point, we don't really know why we have to ask this question to satisfy the previous remark. Again, that capacity just doesn't fit with being, but it fits with coming to be. And so there is this idea, two ideas that are brought up, that the soul knows, and also that being is known. So what can we say of knowing? Well, there's an awareness. It implies agency, at least in our case. In order to know something, we must be something. But there are things that are prerequisite of the things that are, and even of the things that be, in order to be able to conceive or to know of such things. There are plenty of beings, living beings, that are unable to hold the idea that we are speaking of here. So I say that to reiterate that there are conditions, I think, necessary for this knowing. Perhaps there's a through line that I don't see, but at least as far as we are concerned now with thought and intellectual ideas, for this type of knowing to occur, it's quite selective. And I wonder, because of this selectiveness, that is the cause for a certain type of capacity, let's say, that since at least we are talking about the people of the forms, we're talking about how it would have to be internally consistent for them, even though the visitor is probably going to use this to ask a new question. At the very least, again, the people of the forms would identify this selectiveness as the reason that true being is not the same as capacity, or in that case we can still call it a type of selectedness, but it's much broader. The principles aren't as narrow as beings that can know and understand, I guess. So my apologies, but today is a new day. A new day, new thoughts. So I thought for a moment if I should end this episode, because I'm just getting into these 2 pages, and given what we are going to be dealing with, this episode is going to be much longer than 2 hours. But I think I'm just going to continue. At the end of today, I'll probably call it, and we'll start again with part 6. So the question now is to determine where we left off. I want to say a couple words here before we get started. The past couple days have been fairly uneventful in terms of recording. I don't mean to say that nothing has been established, but that flow state that commonly associates itself with me as I go through some of these experiences has been rather lacking. And it is my intention to fall into a good flow state and to make some progression here on these matters. And as a general reminder to myself, I will say that what we are after is to learn something for ourselves, something that we can keep with us, something that we can integrate into our being. So, to recap, the visitor said, "What shall we say this dealing with is that you apply in the 2 cases? Doesn't it mean what we said just now? What happens when 2 things come together? And by some capacity one does something to the other, or has something done to it. Or maybe you don't hear their answer clearly, Theaetetus, but I do, probably because I'm used to them. They don't agree with what we just said to the Earth people about being. We took it as a sufficient definition of beings, that the capacity be present in a thing to do something or have something done to it, to or by even the smallest thing or degree. In reply, they say that coming to be has the capacity to do something or have something done to it, but that this capacity doesn't fit with being. We have to reply that we need them to tell us more clearly whether they agree that the soul knows, and also that being is known. So in response to this, Theaetetus says yes. Again, he is the one that is taking on this position of the people of the forms. Well then, do you say that knowing and being known are cases of doing, or having something done, or both? Is one of them doing, and the other having something done? Or is neither a case of either? So I wish to go into this bit of dialogue to try and rationalize it and then follow further dialogue, keeping in mind that what we may come to is not necessarily what Theaetetus may follow up with. So again, do you say that knowing and being known are cases of doing, or having something done, or both? So just starting there. So knowing and being known. We're trying to determine if one is an active principle and one is a passive principle. So if we start with knowing, it would seem, at least at first glance, that this is something of an active principle. Knowing something is a matter of doing. We can think about it as a matter of recall, but just because it's a matter of recall and there's an activity involved in retrieving from memory, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is of the doing sort. I can identify moments in my life where I have learned things because of my knowledge of them. Over time, there are things that influence me and my decisions more in a passive manner than would occur if I had not known them. And so I think that there is this capacity that knowing can be both a passive and active capacity. Put differently, I can imagine knowing as a type of receptacle that affords something. It allows us to hold something. Now, holding something can be quite passive. If we are allowed to accept versus outright deny, we can still manage that rationalization of passivity, or having the capacity of having something done to us. On the other hand, knowing can be quite active, for it is within the knowing that causes us to be a certain way. It is the generator, the catalyst to farther action. Now, being known. What can we say of this? Being known, I think, implies an external agent, or an agent that is not immediately experienced by the one in question. Let's say that if the attention is on me, then I am the one in this case, the one of attention, not the one capital O. But if I am the one of attention, then being known, I suppose, can come in two forms. I can know myself, and therefore I am known by myself, but also I can be known by my friends, by my family, by people in the community. And so being known in that way is a bit passive. Knowing myself is more of an active experience, at least in my experience, because it involves continual transformation. It involves continual self-reflection. And I think that there are many other avenues that we can go down here, but it would not necessarily be a prerequisite to understand what my opinion is here. I think of both of these, that of knowing and of being known, are both cases of doing and having something done to it, depending on the context. Is one of them doing and the other having something done, or is neither a case of either? So, Theaetetus responds consistently with what has been said about the people of the forms and what they believe. He says, obviously, that neither is a case of either, since otherwise they'd be saying something contrary to what they said before. Now, what they said before is that capacity is important, but only as it applies to the procedure or the process of coming to be. So then, in terms of knowing, although we have established that the soul knows and also being is known, that there is this agreement by the part, or on the part of the people of the forms. If we reintroduce this capacity argument, of course it would be logically inconsistent. The visitor says, you mean that if knowing is doing something, then necessarily what is known has something done to it. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it, which we say wouldn't happen to something that's at rest. Now perhaps I made a logical error earlier. I'm uncertain. But I'd like to keep moving. I think this will come out in time. So, when the visitor responds, there is the implication that you mean that if knowing is doing something, then necessarily what is known has something done to it. Now, in Theaetetus' response, there is not this indication, and so I wonder a little bit about this. But it's not unreasonable to understand why attributing knowing as that capacity, the active capacity, and then that which is known has the passive component, the passive capacity within it. Then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it. So let's think for a moment on this. I think there is a consistency here with what I mentioned about the effect that knowing can have on the disposition or the posture of the being that has that conscious experience attributed to it, that knowing. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it. So this is a little confusing. I want to focus on the word being for a moment. When I type in the definition of being, the response that I get is existence. Animation is a similar word. The nature or essence of a person. To exist. To be present. To occur or to take place. Having the state, quality, identity, nature, role, etc. specified. I suppose that there is a way in which one can see this expression, when being is known by knowledge, as a bit redundant. Because I think there's a way of seeing that would imply that being exists because it is known, because it is identified, because it is specified, because it is something of that which is. And to have being that is unknown may exist conditionally, but no farther, not absolutely. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it. An interesting conception that the knowing of something causes the change to the thing itself. There are many different circumstances for which we can try to imagine this being the case. Then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it. So what then of this pen? Is it changed because I have known it? I have to wonder. Certainly it was changed at some point as it was known. It was known in mind before it was known in physical form. Its identity now is because of knowing. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it, which we say wouldn't happen to something that's at rest. So I think that there's an issue that I have with this, but I'm not quite sure where it is. The first thing that I would like to say is that I still don't understand why the visitor says, he jumps to the conclusion, you mean that if knowledge is doing something, then necessarily what is known has something done to it. And I'm confused at that case. Because Theaetetus responded to the visitor initially by saying that neither is the case of either. Neither in the sense that of our foundational principles, that knowing and being known follow an active or a passive capacity. The interesting thing is that the visitor doesn't really seem to, other than his expression, "Oh, I see," which I think can be overlooked, and I overlooked it the first, I don't know how many times I've read through this by now, but at least 10 times. And now that I see this "oh, I see" on the part of the visitor, I think I understand a little bit more about what's happening here. That Theaetetus has rejected both arguments. But if he is going to reject both of them, then how can we have any sort of conversation about this at all? There is a logical inconsistency here. So the visitor just seems to be choosing something. He says, you mean that if knowledge is doing something, okay, Theaetetus already said that this is neither the case. You mean that if knowledge is doing something, then necessarily what is known has something done to it. When being is known by knowledge, according to this account, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it. So this would be something that's contrary to the Eleatic belief, that once being is, if it is outside of whatever that state is of coming to be, then it cannot be altered. Otherwise it is not being. Which we say wouldn't happen to something that is at rest. Now here's another interesting addition. We wouldn't say that this would happen to something that is at rest. The principle here, I think, is important. I want to read this one more time. When being is known by knowledge, then insofar as it's known, it's changed by having something done to it. We've established this with our analogy about the pen, and there are questions that I still have about this, but we'll take it as it is for now. The reason that we say that which is known is changed by, or maybe I should say, being that is known is changed by that knowing, is because knowing is doing something. And in the act of doing, there is capacity. And what is the capacity for? It is for change. Now, rest is an interesting word to use in this situation. Because, like with many words, they end up being conditional. And the first place that my mind goes to is mechanical rest. That there is an object that is sitting, let's say outside in the middle of the street, and there's nothing acting on it, so it remains at rest. Now, in the physics sense, this isn't necessarily the case, because we know that an object in motion will stay in motion. But again, contextually speaking here, if we find something, whether it be in the space of mind or in the space of the street, where it is not moving, our immediate perception is that whatever comes into contact with the thing that is steady or is where it is, then it will change it by its relationship with it. The visitor continues, he says, but for heaven's sake, are we going to be convinced that it's true that change, life, soul, and intelligence are not present in that which wholly is, and that it neither lives nor thinks, but stays changeless, solemn, and holy, without any understanding? And I would say that the reason that all of these things that are brought up here are brought up in the way that they are, because the professors of the forms say that true being always stays the same, but as we go back here for a moment, we deal with real being by our souls, that it exists within the form, in the realm of the forms. But if we have just established that if knowing is doing something, and what is known has something done to it, that would apply to change, life, soul, intelligence. And when he says that which wholly is, I think it is a reference to the Eleatic. It is a reference to the people of the forms that say that true being is only in that domain, and that it remains static. Now, this issue of coming to be, I think, throws a little bit of a question mark there, at least in terms of their view. He continues, and that it neither lives nor thinks, but stays changeless. Now, when he says it, he's referring to that which wholly is, the principal identity. the whole of the identity, without the change, without the coming to be, or falling away from. Solemn and holy, without any understanding. Now let's try and define this word holy for a moment. The word holy means something that is sacred, consecrated, is set apart for divine purposes and worship. Now, in the sense that we speak about that which holy is here, there is this identification on the part of the people that believe in the forms, or that believe in the unchanging nature of the true being of the form, let's say, that within this holiness, the wholeness, the realness, the trueness of that thing that is, the true being that is somehow separate from everything that was mentioned here, from any change at all. Another definition of the word holy is morally or spiritually pure, associated with the divine or worthy of reverence. Again, one must wonder, within this idea of purity is the idea of identification or identity itself, which implies sameness. But as with many things, I think that this idea of sameness implies, well, maybe it doesn't imply, but it requires more of a nuanced approach in order to understand its oneness or its being. This is something that I'm immensely curious about. So etymologically, from Old English, we have the meaning sacred, consecrated, spiritually pure. From the Old English root, we have the meaning of something that is whole, uninjured, healthy. From the Proto-Indo-European, we have, again, the idea of wholeness, that which is unbroken, safe, and healthy. Now the word solemn means formal, dignified, in a serious tone or manner, ceremonial, or sacred. Binding or grave, as in a solemn promise. Etymologically, from our English, we have religious, ceremonial, formal. From Latin, we have something that is yearly, established, ritual, sacred. Again, from Latin, we have entire or whole. And from Latin, also we have annual or yearly. So keeping in mind these ideas of regularity, of singularity, of that which is unchanging, we move into our space, our thoughtful space. I want to read this dialogue one more time. But for heaven's sake, are we going to be convinced that it's true that change, life, soul, and intelligence are not present in that which wholly is, and that it neither lives nor thinks, but stays changeless, solemn, and holy, without any understanding? Now, the interesting part about this, or maybe one of many things that are interesting about this, what is mentioned are 4 words: change, life, soul, and intelligence. The 4 words that are not present in that which wholly is. And so what then would be the commonality to all of these things? Perhaps that they're subject to change. Perhaps because there is a capacity, which again would mean that they're subject to change. Theaetetus responds to the visitor by saying, "If we did, sir, we'd be admitting something frightening." The visitor says, "But are we going to say that it has understanding, but doesn't have life?" So the it that the visitor is referring to must be that which wholly is. Again, a reminder that we're trying to conceptualize true being. And we're, I think, moving into a sort of a riff. Less focused on Theaetetus's maintenance of the argument of the people of the forms. The forms, again, being that absolute being, the true being. That which wholly is a difficult concept to understand and to define true being. But we're asking certain questions about it. It would seem to me to be taking a few giant steps here. Now, why do I say this? I say this because moving into the realm of that true being, of that which wholly is, we are now curious about not necessarily agency, but intelligence, understanding. We have moved from our capacity argument into something that is quite particular. The particular is a cry, I'll say. It is a cry for our own meaning and for our own purpose. For heaven's sake, are we going to be convinced that it's true that change, life, soul, and intelligence are not present in that which wholly is? Putting aside what it means by that which wholly is for a moment. There would seem to be a cry or a lament to the fact that this thing that we call that which wholly is quite important to us. That true being holds high status. And that other things that hold high status for us, like the words mentioned, change, life, soul, and intelligence, they must be somehow related to the purity of thingness or being that we can conceptualize. So the visitor says, but are we going to say that it has understanding but doesn't have life? Again, that which wholly is. But if something wholly is doesn't have life, then what does our experience mean in the broader context of things? What is this in-between state, the coming to be? The visitor says, are we saying that it has both those things in it while denying that it has them in a soul? Now this implies the importance of understanding and life to the soul. Theaetetus even responds, how else would it have them? How else outside of the soul would it have them? And I'm always curious about ways to define the soul and new ways of thinking about it. And just pausing here for a moment to consider that life and understanding are necessary components of the soul, or that the soul provides these things. If I were to add this onto my existing conception, that the soul is a dynamic structure, that it is, in my mind, I think part of it at least, is like a divine pipe. I'm imagining all sorts of fanciful colors and lights that surround this pipe, or I could say a circular passageway between one place and another. The place on the side that I can see is just that. It is the plane of existence that I inhabit. And it is this being and the awareness of being and this perception, the living experience, the purposeful, directed experience that the human being is, what is reflected, or perhaps what flows into me, and maybe what also flows out of me into this other place, other plane, is all of those things which don't quite come to me perceptually. Or rather, I should say, maybe not perceptually, because certainly I perceive things like love, goodness and beauty, intelligence. But the things that I cannot touch with my hands, but I can perceive through other senses. Now, I can't touch a smell, for example, but I can perceive a smell. It doesn't mean the smell is not there. But this other conceptual domain, conceptual placeholder, is the place that allows us to receive this thing. And I think that the definition of this thing can be expanded quite large. I've identified a few elements of it, love being an important part of it, but many things that we can seemingly perceive but cannot really touch. Smell, I wouldn't necessarily say is a part of this, other than it's a part of life. If we are to say that now, in this conception here, that understanding and life are necessary components, that the soul offers these things, that would mean that mind, of course, is an active participant in this. It's not just enough to say that what the soul is a conduit, one passage place for information to flow through, and that the soul for man's experience looks different than the soul for a rock, for example, while the soul for a rock is still exposed to this reality. The soul of man is something entirely different because of his capacity, because of the degree to which he can be affected or he can have an effect on. Whereas again, inert forms of matter have a lower capacity for interacting with that which is, that which wholly is. Are we saying that it has intelligence, life, and soul, but that it's at rest and completely changeless, even though it's alive? Is such a thing possible? Theaetetus responds, all of that seems completely unreasonable. The visitor, then both that which changes and also change have to be admitted as being. So here we find ourselves almost back to that same territory. That which changes and also change. I think of that which is and that which is not. For change itself lies or rests within that domain that I had mentioned earlier. This is my personal belief, that that which is not is subject to that which is. That thingness is a necessary precondition for nothingness. But nothingness is contextual. We may find nothingness in places that are distressing to our senses and to our hearts, but change is a necessary component of being, or of that which is. It's necessary not because of absence, but because of a word like adaptation, growth. There's a lot of experience that can be caught up in things like this. Good and bad exist within these domains. We find love and we find evil, we find creation, we find destruction. That which changes is an act of being. It is a being of presence. It is a being of that which is. But it is an actor that promotes that change. It is not as though, I suppose it could be reasoned, that change itself is a state of being, that can be a state of being, that can begin from a place of nothing. It would seem rather unlikely. Because what would change be? Change from nothing to something seems to be an argument that just cannot begin, because there is nothing to start it. There's no thing to begin it. And so, Theaetetus, it turns out that if no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything. Now, before I go any farther, I think it's important to bring up a few terms that necessarily come up in mind. One is God. The second is the relationship of the whole. And if we are believers in God, if God is the whole of the whole, or if he is somehow outside of the whole, the creator of the whole. And here there are words that come to mind like pantheism, where God is the whole, let's say. Monotheism, I may be incorrect about this, but there is an idea of difference there, that although I am a creation of God, I am an independent agent. And there is this intricate relationship between us. Although connected by soul, separate by agency. And so it would seem a bit bizarre to say that God is, that I am God, because of course I am not all of God. I possess maybe a quality, even in the smallest sense, that God may possess. But shared qualities don't mean necessarily shared identity. Then both that which changes and also change have to be admitted as being. If no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything. So let's try to make sense of this statement. If no beings change, no beings move from one state to another, then why is it the case that nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything? The underlying assumption there is that intelligence requires change. That if learning is to take place, or if knowing is to take place, it requires receiving information that at one time was not. And so, while I think that this is a process of coming to be, I go back to my old assertion that this process of coming to be and being itself cannot be disconnected. that we cannot just sort of formalize true being apart from everything else. It is connected in a sophisticated network of things, of something that is identifiable. So I'm going to end this episode here because it's getting a little long, and I'm going to jump right into the next one. So until next time,